Last month, a survey was conducted amongst life science researchers asking them what was limiting their use of AI in their organizations. Several reasons were mentioned, the lack of data standards, regulatory constraints, but the number one challenge, head and shoulders above every other, was the availability of data. Data availability is really what is slowing down the advent of AI for precision medicine, and that's the future of healthcare. In this keynote, I'll talk about Federated Learning, which is an emerging framework to address this very specific challenge of data availability. And I'll do so specifically in the context of cancer care. Now, before we do that, let's contextualize a bit what we mean by precision medicine. Looking backwards, the 20th century has seen our lifespan double as humans, and this is in part credited to the use of antibiotics, which are known to be very effective against bacterial infections. And this illustrates what conventional medicine does. It identifies a problem, here bacterial infections, and it prescribes a solution, antibiotics, in a one-size-fits-all approach. There are many such examples of this, and yes, this approach, conventional medicine, has saved and extended many lives. Cancer doesn't escape this rather monolithic view of disease. So here's a very macro view from the World Health Organization, and it shows cancer, one disease, which you can further describe based on where in the body it grows, and you can also measure its impact in terms of mortality. And the numbers are staggering. Roughly 20 million new diagnoses last year and 2 million deaths. And as you look into the treatment pathways for cancer, you see a similar one-size-fits-all approach, where all patients can expect to receive a more or less precise diagnostic, more or less early in the progression of the disease. And this diagnostic will dictate the sort of treatment that they'll receive. And most often, this treatment will include all or some of surgery, chemotherapy, and radiotherapy, which have side effects that are detrimental to the quality of life of the patients. Thankfully, we also see the emergence of targeted therapies, which address the specific biology of the disease. And as millions of patients go through these pathways, treatment pathways, we see a lot of variability. What works for one doesn't work for the other. Some patients respond really well, and they go into remission, while others only suffer the side effects, and there's no benefit on the tumor side. So this can be very disheartening for patients and really is the limit of conventional medicine. As individuals, we all know people who are suffering or have suffered from cancer, perhaps have passed. We know the physical pain, of course, but also the psychological pain that they have endured going through these treatment pathways that have such uncertain outcomes. Not because the treatments are bad, they're not, but because too often, at the time of diagnosis, it's impossible for physicians to know whether these treatments will work for them or not. So every individual carries a lot of biological complexity, and so do the tumors within them. So we owe it for the patients to understand this biological complexity so we can see how AI can help develop and prescribe the right treatments. So let's dive into this complexity. What you see here is the various data modalities that are available. In recent years, there's been tremendous progress in both technology and biology, particularly the genetic side. Unfortunately, genetics don't explain everything, and it's still too complex and costly to sequence every patient. As a result, this genomic data is not available for the vast majority of patients in routine care. The modalities that are collected on patients in a routine fashion are radiology and histology. Radiology is ubiquitous because it's non-invasive imagery. The patients will go through these large donut-shaped machines, and the resulting CT scans and MRIs are analyzed by expert physicians who can look at them and diagnose and grade the tumor. Histology, at the top left here, is the study of tissue. It's more invasive because you have to collect the tissue using core needle biopsy or during surgical removal of the tumor. But the advantage of this modality is that you're really looking directly into the tumor. Last but not least is clinical data, which encompasses every data that is collected over time from the patients during their consultations. So in here, you'll find age, gender, living habits, as well as information on the treatments that patients have received. So you start to see that each of these data modality sheds light from a different angle on the disease, and collectively can start to form a pretty precise picture of what is happening. These data modalities can explain why two seemingly very similar patients can respond very differently to the same treatments. And that's precision medicine. That's the promise that it holds for cancer patients. It's data-driven oncology. So how can AI help? Let's look more closely at a histology slide. What are we really looking at? So once the tissue is extracted, it's first processed, then sliced, and placed onto a glass slide, very similar to the glass slide you use under the microscope in biology class. And before you can see anything, you have to stain it with specific chemicals that make the structures in the cell appear in this typical pink color. This is very similar to the contrast agents that are used in developing analog photography back in the day. So in a traditional pathology lab, you'll have an expert-trained physician who looks at this very image in high resolution under the microscope, makes morphological measurements of the morphological features, follows numerous guidelines to be able to diagnose and grade the cancer, counting the cells that are stained a certain way or another. And this analysis, they only get about 2 minutes to do it. And the image that you're looking at right now weighs about 4 gigs. So that's about the size of a Netflix movie. So think about that for a second. The amount of information in a slide like this that, however expertly trained, a physician cannot really spend time on. So this is where AI can help. Deep learning algorithms, leveraging cutting-edge techniques, such as convolutional neural networks, can really extract the signal from these images. And the applications are vast. I'll cover a few in this talk. Our first example describes how AI can help oncologists prescribe the right course of treatment for breast cancer patients. A common classification of cancer follows whether there is the presence or absence of certain molecular receptors at the surface of cancer cells. So the majority of breast cancer patients are HR plus and HER2 minus, which means that they test positive for either estrogen or progesterone hormone receptors and negative for their HER2 protein. And these receptors can be seen as handles from which to grapple with the disease. And so this group of patients will receive endocrine therapy, which will starve off the tumor from the hormones that they rely on to grow. And treatments will very often also entail chemotherapy. Now, the problem with this chemotherapy is that it's a cumbersome treatment with side effects that affect the quality of life of the patients. But for the vast majority of patients, the physician doesn't have a way to know whether it will even be useful. So that's the question that the team set out to answer from routine information, which involves those histology slides. This was a collaboration between Owkin data scientists and researchers at Institut Gustave Roussy, which is Europe's largest cancer center. So they trained a predictive model on hundreds of these histology slides for which it was known whether the cancer had come back or not after initial treatment. And the model was able to predict with a very high degree of confidence whether a patient would relapse in the next 5 years. Now, why is this important? If the algorithm labels you at a very low risk of relapse, the oncologist may decide that you don't need the chemotherapy and spare you. On the other hand, if you have a high risk of relapse, then the oncologist may anticipate, prescribe you with chemotherapy right away without any worry that it might not be useful. Our second example shows us how we can go beyond the prediction and gain insights on the biological signal that lies behind. So the team followed the same course of action, training a predictive model on thousands of histology slides to predict the survival of mesothelioma patients. Mesothelioma is a very aggressive form of cancer, which affects the lining of the lungs. And the median survival is less than a year from diagnosis. So the model here not only was able to predict survival and a very high degree of confidence, but it was able to understand the variability between patients that live much longer than others. And there's a lot to learn from these differences. So not only was it able to predict survival, it was also built with interpretability features that enables you to zoom into the very specific parts of the histology slide that were most correlated with the scoring, with the result of the model. And when you look at these regions, with the help of expert physicians and biologists, we could identify specific morphological feature within the tumor microenvironments that were associated with a novel classification of mesothelioma patients. And this is very important because it opens the door for improved clinical trials and even developing new hypotheses on the biological mechanism, which can help develop new therapies. Now let's switch gears to federated learning. This was all great, but to reach the real impact of these AI technologies and their regulatory clearance as well, we need a lot of data. And you may have guessed the problem that precision medicine poses already, in that every patient is unique. And so it's no longer about this 20 million figure of number of new diagnoses every year. You have to be able to find sufficient data for very specific subtypes of patients. For example, ovarian cancer patients that have both an HRD mutation and a microsatellite instability. The more you go into this precision medicine, the more you're dealing with what essentially is a rare disease. And therefore, you're facing the problem of finding sufficient good data. So the data is scattered in nature because no cancer center is large enough to have enough historical data to feed those hungry machine learning algorithms on every specific subtype of disease. And not only is it distributed, but data is also siloed because of patient privacy, IP concerns, regulations, and even out of practicality, you can't really move data around like this. Federated learning is the answer to overcome these challenges. Don't move the data, let the algorithms travel. So the sketch that you see here is an example of a federated learning consortium. The partners are life science companies, as well as hospitals, and really any other stakeholder that has data to contribute. The federated learning software, Owkin Connect, can be deployed either in the cloud or on physical servers on-premise behind the hospital's firewall. And every operation on this network can be traced by a blockchain and audited by partners to satisfy the greatest standards in terms of data privacy and security. Once this infrastructure is in place, the central orchestrator can launch the training of the model, which travels from center to center, coming back to the aggregator, which can then relaunch training in this iterative fashion until we have reached the best possible model. Now imagine this infrastructure and this software being deployed in every single hospital around the world. This is our dream at Owkin, and we're working towards it. In the meantime, we do have some real-world deployments of this technology. The Melody Consortium is the first one of its kind, and it's a consortium that's funded by the EU. It involves 10 of the largest pharma companies in the world on the topic of drug discovery. And the data that is distributed here is really their treasure trove. It's 10 million annotated molecules, which are either existing or potential drug candidates, drug assets, and 1 billion associated data points. These lab assay data points are every measure that are relevant for the assessment of both safety and efficacy of these potential drug compounds. So you can understand how sensitive and proprietary this data is. These companies are competitors to each other, so you can understand also, imagine the expectations on us, the provider of this infrastructure, to guarantee the safety and security of their data. They're competitors, but they agree to come together in this cooperative project because they believe that they can create better predictive models collectively than they can on their own. So this project is deployed, the training is in progress, and once completed, each pharma company will have a model that can predict the lab assay results for novel molecules that is tailored to their own data sets, but also enriched from the collective data. This is really a new paradigm for drug discovery research. Our last example takes us back to this classification of breast cancer. There's another subgroup that's called triple negative breast cancer. Triple negative because the patients test negative for progesterone and estrogen hormone receptors, as well as the HER2 protein. So there's no handles to grapple with the disease, and these 10% of patients have no targeted therapies for them, and so mortality is high. The treatment often does involve what is a 6-month neoadjuvant chemotherapy. And the goal of this chemotherapy is to shrink the size of the tumor before it can be removed. And the problem is, too often, sometimes it doesn't work, and too often we really don't know why. And so the team asked this very question, is can we predict the response to this chemotherapy from the diagnostic information alone? And so this was a project in collaboration between Owkin and 2 leading cancer centers in France. And federating these data sets was really essential to creating the critical mass of data that was necessary to train this predictive model. And as a result, the model was able to predict response to chemotherapy here. And why is it so important? Neoadjuvant chemotherapy is toxic for the heart. And so if you can know if a patient will respond, then you might be able to prescribe a lighter chemotherapy. And if you can predict that it's very unlikely that that will work, time is of the essence, and the oncologist can already prescribe a different kind of chemotherapy or even alternative treatments right from the get-go. And what we see when we use create these federated models is that they tend to be more robust and create results that are more reproducible and more generalizable than those created in a single center. And this is really paramount to their broad use in the future. As a closing remark, I wanted to leave you with a vision of the future. In many years, humans will still be at the center of this research ecosystem. AI is not going to take over healthcare jobs, but those jobs will change a lot. So here's our physician of the future. At her fingertips is 100% of her patient's data, including all the data modalities that we have not invented yet. And this data will be immediately confronted to a multitude of predictive models that have been trained on federated data sets all around the world. And as a result of that, diagnosis will be immediate and precise, and this physician will be able to prescribe her patients with the right therapy for the very specific subtype that the patient is from. And what I want to stretch here is that this futuristic picture really does not rely on any disruptive innovation. From a purely technological standpoint, all the pieces for this puzzle already exist. And so the future is really already at our fingertips today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to take this off, otherwise I can hear myself. So thank you so much. It's so insightful. So I have a burning question. So you already talk a lot about all of the challenges, like not only clustering data, but also orchestrating a lot of different partners. If you're just going to look at from your own perspective, from your own company, what is the number one challenge that you're going to focus on for the next year or two in order to actually progress in terms of your grand mission, as you also talked about before?
Sure. So coming back to these specific challenges, there is, of course, the scattering of data. But when we look more specifically, when we're actually able to draw the various stakeholders around the table to in principle share the data. The challenge comes from both the scalability, the number of centers that we can bring together here, and the repeatability and the relevance of the scientific questions that we ask of these consortium. So in theory, federated learning is very agnostic to the types of models that you develop. In practice, the main difficulty, especially when you're a very, what we call cooperative environments with competitors here that are not going to open their data, even to you, a third party, is that of data harmonization and data quality. And so this is what is in the Melody project, for example, taking a lot of energy, is to be able to create data standards that all of the parties can adhere to, so that then we can really launch the training. There's a lot of preparation that goes into this. So what we're focusing on in the next year or two is to focus those scalability efforts on specific questions that we know first that the data can answer, and second, that we're working with parties that are giving us enough glimpse of the data that we can in fact create this harmonization ourselves rather than just rely on the various partners to register quality data according to the same standards into the federated channel. Because that's, you can imagine, be the source of lots of headaches.
Yeah. And from a very pragmatic point of view, how close are we to actually be able to offer precision medicine to patients, not only within cancer, but in other diseases as well?
So it's both the positive and the negative. Like I said, that there's not a whole lot of technological breakthrough that needs to happen. That's for the optimistic part. And then the pessimistic part is that there's a bunch of different hurdles that I haven't talked about in this keynote that are beyond technology and data. And that's those are processes of regulatory approval. You can imagine also, for example, as you get more into precision medicine, you have less and less volume of patients that you can enroll into the clinical trials that you need to validate those precision therapies. Yep. So it's a bit of a conundrum, and there's a number of methodologies that are being developed right now to overcome these challenges, and the FDA, as well as the EMA and other organizations, are spending a lot of effort trying to understand how they will change themselves their standards to be able to approve these therapies in a more prompt manner. Yeah. And so a lot of these methodologies also rely on the use of artificial intelligence. Those are things that Owkin is working on as well. I didn't talk about today. But for example, the use of control arms in clinical trials is very difficult to grapple with, because you have patients that need a therapy and it's very difficult to enroll people and give them a placebo treatment. Yeah. And so there are ways to leverage machine learning to create what's called external or synthetic control arms, where we can predict a patient's response to a placebo without having to actually not enroll them in the experimental arm. Yeah. So those are examples of hurdles that make really the emergence of precision medicine slower, yeah. But it will happen. It
will happen. No, it sounds good. We just have one question, so let's just move closer to the screen. The audience can also see it on the big screen. So what are the consequences of relying on black box? Oh, and now it came big. Relying on black box models for life or death decisions, such as clinical treatments. Does it worry the regulators or patients?
The short answer is yes, it worries the regulators and the patients, but we're not so much talking about black box model necessarily, and this is where there's likely to be a continuum in the adoption of AI technologies, from what is decision support tools to diagnostics that are directly used in life or death decisions. And so an example is I've talked about the pathologist that's looking at the histology slide under the microscope. Enabling those pathologists to have the results from these models is already a huge help. It does not make the decision whether or not to prescribe a specific therapy. Now, there's different. I also mentioned how you can predict a certain response to certain treatments. There are also very costly tests, genomic tests that exist that you could do that, but these tests are not available in the routine care of patients. So an example of the use of AI could be also pre-screening, where you're not making the direct life or death decision, but you're pre-screening, call it 100% of the patients for a specific condition that may give them access to a specific drug. And in routine care, most patients would miss this therapy. So in this example, it's not the life or death decision. It can be about pre-screening to then give the very expensive genomic test to a quote-unquote enriched patient population that is likely to respond to that drug. So to summarize, I really want to stress this continuum of adoption of AI. And then the regulators, yes, there's very specific clinical validations that some of these have to undergo to actually be able to be used in a diagnostic setting where it's not just about decision support.
Well, thank you so much. Give a
you.
big hand to Hubert.